Okay, welcome to, this will be session number 16 of Old Testament Survey. We're all the way up to the end of the fourth chapter of Exodus. And as you'll recall, Exodus is the story of redemption. This is God reaching down with a mighty hand, using Moses as his instrument to bring the people up out of Egypt and prepare them to go in to the promised land. So God is in the process of fulfilling his promises. And we notice that he chooses a human instrument to operate as the prophet, as the priest, as the leader, as the military warlord. So Moses is a very, very important person in all of this. And we see Moses set apart by God for this specific ministry. This is Moses' call. Moses is called to be the prophet to Israel, and thus the model for all prophets. Moses is the guy. If you want to know whether or not some other character who comes up historically is a prophet from God, compare him with Moses, and you'll see. In Deuteronomy, Moses says that after a long time, there'll be another prophet like me who will be raised up by God, and he will deliver you from your sins. So Moses is looking toward the coming of Christ. Now, of course, not everybody believes that. The Muslim world believes that the coming prophet is Muhammad, but that's not a claim that can be taken seriously historically. So let's go ahead and begin at the very end of chapter 4. I'm going to share the screen. Eventually, we always have to share this screen, and we'll get the presenter view. There we go. I'm actually going to begin the end of chapter 4. We were looking at the burning bush. That's the burning bush there on the left. And at some of the events that are taking place here on Mount Sinai. There's Hatshepsut's tomb in the background. So that all looks at the childhood of Moses. The end of chapter 4, we see Moses returning to Egypt, intending to go before Pharaoh and convince Pharaoh that he ought to let the people go. That's the point of the whole thing. Let the people go. They will go out in the wilderness and worship. God says to Moses, "This is the way that you will know that I am with you and that I have sent you. For when the people come out of Egypt, they will come here to this mountain to worship God." So we're expecting a trip back to Sinai eventually. As we go along, Moses is continually hesitant. Moses has given his brother Aaron as a prophet, which is fascinating to me. God says, and I'm not going to point it out, it's going to take me too long to find it. God says to Moses, I will make you like God to Pharaoh, and I will make Aaron your prophet. So the idea of prophecy is a spokesman for God. Moses is the prophet, but Aaron is a prophet for Moses, who will speak to Pharaoh. At the end of chapter 4, we've got Moses and Aaron gathering together all of the elders of the people of Israel, and they spoke the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did all of the signs in the sight of the people. The people believed when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel, that he had seen their affliction. They bowed their heads and worshiped. So here we have the people of Israel expressing faith in what they're hearing, and they're putting that into action by an active submission to God. The worship here is not ritual. This is not meaningless repetition of words. Worship is always a voluntary, enthusiastic submission to God. I choose to submit to God. I'm enthusiastic about submitting to God. I give him all that I am. And the people here are being honest up to a point. This is the first act of faith that we're going to see on the part of the people of Israel, or at least on the part of the elders of Israel. In chapter 5, we've got a meanwhile back in Egypt moment. Moses and Aaron went to the Pharaoh and they said, "Hello, Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." And Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go?" Now that's actually quite a reasonable question. Anybody who walks in claiming to be God's spokesman should anticipate some skepticism and should expect to need to prove his point. So Pharaoh says to Moses, "Why should I bother?" And during this section from chapters 5 through 7, we've got 3 interviews with Pharaoh, and they all go rather badly. It's not going to work. Pharaoh is going to make life difficult. The first thing that Pharaoh does to make life difficult is to insist that the bricks that the people of Israel make for him be made without straw. That is, he's not going to have the taskmasters provide the straw to make bricks. You've got to go out and find it for yourselves. And that would be a very difficult thing. Straw is what it is. It's actually essential to brick making. So the bricks that the Israelites made would fall apart. They would crumble. If the Israelites took a dried brick, a stack of dried bricks, and they piled them up, the weight of the bricks themselves would crush the bricks at the bottom. They would all crumble. It would all fall down. This wouldn't turn out well. It wouldn't be a good thing at all. And Pharaoh undoubtedly knew that. So it's rather a strange thing. It seems like it's not wise. Moses tried to get Pharaoh to change his mind. Pharaoh makes it even worse. The people of Israel met with Moses and said, "Wow, this is really awful. You've made us a stench in the nostrils of Pharaoh." Moses can't win for losing here. Moses is in a difficult place that is well known to anyone who chooses to be a leader amongst God's people. The people of God tend to be immature by definition. We're all growing. And we all respond badly from time to time. These people are going to respond badly, which is too bad. That means that they're not going to cooperate with what they have already promised. At any rate, in chapter 6, there's a reiteration of God's promises. God says to Moses, "Stand still and see what I'm going to do to Pharaoh." Pharaoh is wondering how he can know that you're speaking from me. The people of Israel are wondering how long they're going to have to put up with this. So just watch this, and you'll see. I'm going to bring them out with a strong hand, and I will drive them. He will drive the people out of the land. He will want you gone. So not only will you escape, but Pharaoh is going to encourage you to go, and so much so that you will be sent out with great riches. It's quite a promise. The last part of chapter 6 takes us through a genealogy of Moses and Aaron, demonstrates that they are, in fact, of the tribe of Levi. Moses is not in the messianic line. Moses is in the line of Levi, and the messianic line is going to pass through Judah, not Levi. Chapter 7, we see Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh one more time. And this time we're going to begin seeing some problems because Moses is given the ability in verses from 7:20 all the way through chapter 12. Moses is given the ability to provide 10 plagues of judgment on Egypt. And these are interesting. They start out with all the water in Egypt turned to blood. Now, most of that water is the Nile River. For the Nile River to turn to blood would be quite an amazing sign on the surface of it, and also a really damaging thing. Now, we're not told that this is turned literally into human or animal blood. That would really make a mess, and it would be hard to clean up. It would result in the death of just about everybody. It's entirely possible that the Nile is simply turned blood red with some kind of added stuff, maybe algae, whatever. The point is that the Nile is one of the Egyptian gods, and I've forgotten which one. Maybe Hathor the cow, or one of the others. The Nile is the gift of annual fertility to the people of Egypt, and they worshipped the Nile. Changing the Nile to a bloody red color, making the water undrinkable, is a sign is not merely a miracle to get the people's attention. It's a judgment on one of the gods of Egypt. As we walk through the 10 plagues, it's good to remember, and I won't go through each one in sequence, but it's good to remember that each of the 10 plagues is a judgment on a separate god of Egypt. And so this tomb painting that you see in the background has a servant in the middle, a priest, along with several different gods. The one on the left that looks like a crocodile, and the one second from the left looks like a hare, and the one on the right looks like a hawk. Each one of those is a different god. There are some 800 or 900 Egyptian gods and goddesses of various sorts. Some of them are really important, like Amun and Re. Some are less important, but all of them have their place in this complex, self-contradictory mythology of Egypt. It's a fascinating thing to study. Because these various gods grew up in various parts of Egypt, and as Egypt was unified over the centuries, the winners of these unification battles didn't eliminate the losing gods. They simply combined them, renamed them, added them to the portfolio. So you end up with hundreds of gods. One of the guides that I have worked with in Egypt is a fellow by the name of Nasir, a young man, just about college age, and Bedouin from the Sinai. I really like him a lot. He's Muslim, but a very, very nice guy. And during the years that I was going to Egypt, he was finishing up with his apprenticeship as a guide. And with my last trip there, he was preparing to get married. And he had the hope of one day going off to graduate school. They're in Cairo. They've got a very good archaeology school there, and he wanted to become an expert in the gods of ancient Egypt. And I've often wondered what has happened to him. I've lost track of him. But that would be a gigantic project, trying to systematize and then write down the information about all of those gods and where they came from and what they stood for. Well, the forces of nature, the created world, the created things, like hawks and water birds and crocodiles and the Nile and bulls and frogs and bugs of various kinds, were all considered gods. So we've got this first plague. The Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he's going out to the water. Stand by the bank of the Nile. Take in your hand your staff that turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, the Lord, God of the Hebrews, sent me to say to you, let my people go, that they may serve me. So you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you shall know that I am the Lord. Behold, with this staff that's in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn to blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. Okay, so I've gone into a little detail on that first plague because I want you to see the nature of the miracle that's going on here. God didn't simply turn the water into blood. God specifically empowered Moses so that it would be clear that it was Moses calling down the power of God. Pharaoh needed to understand that he was dealing not merely with a transcendent, infinitely distant God, but with a representative of God who came with the power of God right into his very presence. And this also has the effect of authenticating Moses in the sight of Israel. So all of the people knew this story right away. It was very, very well known. Now, interestingly, Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded, and everything, all the water turned to blood. The Nile stank. The Egyptians couldn't drink it. And there was blood throughout the land. But verse 22, 722, the magicians of Egypt did the same thing by their secret arts. They had already done some things with the snake. You'll remember the staff of Moses turns into a snake, and then when you pick it up, turns back into a staff. And the Egyptians were able to do that. The magicians of Egypt were able to do that trick. So I'll just make a note here. The magicians of Egypt were not like modern magicians. They weren't merely doing sleight of hand and illusions. they had real power. The magicians of the ancient world, and even the wizards and witches and others who can do this sort of thing today, do so with the power of Satan himself. The magicians are satanically empowered. So it was entirely possible for them to make water into blood. They could duplicate the plague. What's interesting, and I think very important, is that the magicians couldn't make the problem better. They could make what little water had not been turned into blood, apparently, into more blood. They could make the problem worse. Satanic power is almost always destructive, not constructive. Satan can't make anything valuable, but he can destroy things. In the same way, we can tell the difference between people and societies who are primarily driven by godly motives and those who are driven by satanic power. Because the godly society will tend to be productive, it will tend to be constructive, it will tend to build good things. The people are happy, they are free, they are productive. Prosperity eventually happens in those places. The opposite is also true. When a society is animated by a devotion to Satan, to the extent that that's true, that society becomes destructive. And it's like recently here in the United States, I don't believe the recent riots and arson and looting have been a constructive thing. We see riots in major cities in America. This is a bad thing. Perhaps there is some valuable point that people are trying to make, but all they seem to be capable of doing is destroying their communities rather than solving problems and building things up. It's going to require some godly effort. And frankly, I'm not sure where that's going to come from. I'm not sure how that's going to happen, but that's where it has to come from. The godly and ungodly, the theocentric and the satanically centric are opposing forces in the world. And we see them coming into conflict here in Exodus. Again, an interesting point is that the magicians are only able to duplicate the damaging plague twice. They can do the blood, and then they can do the frogs. The second plague in chapter 8 is a plague of frogs. Go to Pharaoh and say, let my people go. And if you refuse, I'm going to plague your country with frogs. And Pharaoh said, why should I let them go? And he hardened his heart. And so Moses stuck out his rod, and the frogs started coming out of the Nile. Frogs are everywhere. People were walking on frogs. They were squishing frogs underneath them. They were slimy. They're a big problem. Now, significantly, the frog in Egypt is a god. His name is Sep, as I recall. And sometimes you'll see the frog in the hieroglyphics. The frog is considered a god. And so I can visualize God looking down at the Egyptians and saying, "You like frogs? Do you? These are a god for you. Very well, have some more. We can make more frogs." So Pharaoh called his magicians and said, "We've got too many frogs. We've got a problem with frogs all over the place. Do something about it." And instead of solving the problem, which would have involved making the frogs go away, the magicians were able to make still more frogs. Uh, they didn't solve the problem, they're just doing more damage. The third uh, plague is a plague of gnats or perhaps lice. They start out as lice and they turn into gnats, little worms that turn into stuff. They're not a good thing. The magicians tried to produce their own gnats, we're told in 816, but they couldn't do it. So the magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hardened. The Hebrew text in these first few plagues, up to the fifth plague, we see that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. And that's explicit in the Hebrew. It isn't always clear in our Western translations. So we got blood, frogs, gnats or lice. This is followed by flies. The flies are actually the scarab beetle. They're very common in Egypt. It's actually a cute little beetle. They can be pretty good size. They can be the size of your thumbnail, and they fly around. The scarab beetles are used as the model for a scarab seal. And we find a whole bunch of these in the ancient world. Wherever the Egyptians went, they would make these seals, and it looks like a little marble or limestone beetle with the wings and the head and all of that on one side, and then on the other side is a flat oval surface that's used for some hieroglyphics and some carvings. That's pressed into clay to make a seal. So the scarab beetle is yet another god, and there you have it. The fifth plague is a cattle murrain, is what it's often called. It's like a hoof and mouth disease. The cattle began to die, and it's not the disease itself that is the god, but rather the cows. The chief goddess of fertility is Hathor. Hathor is a cow, complete with horns and everything. And for the cows to die, all of the Egyptian livestock, cattle begin to die, is another judgment on the gods. And with this fifth plague, Pharaoh hardened his heart and he wouldn't let the people go. The sixth plague is a plague of boils, and some have suggested this is part of a bubonic plague. The fine dust that Moses threw in the air becomes dust all over Egypt. It becomes boils breaking out in sores on man and beast. They took soot from the kiln, threw it in the air, became boils. The magicians couldn't stand before Moses, for the boils came upon them and all the Egyptians. And the Lord, at this point, verse 12, hardened the heart of Pharaoh, and he did not listen. From plague 6 on to the end, it's as though Pharaoh no longer has a choice in the matter. God has looked at Pharaoh and said, these 5 plagues, you've chosen not to listen. You've hardened your heart. From now on, I will harden your heart, and we will continue these plagues all the way to the end, and this will result in the judgment of Egypt. So the sixth plague happens, and this goes on to the seventh. The seventh plague is hail, hail and fire coming out of heaven. The hail and fire would be a horrendous thunderstorm. Those of you who are from the Philippines know all about thunderstorms. In the afternoon, especially in the summertime. Those thunder boomers get so big, and then the rain comes down in buckets. If it's just a little colder up above, as in our country, it can come down as hail. And for Egypt to experience thunderstorms is quite the amazing thing. I don't know if it's ever actually happened since then. I don't know what the statistics are, but I do know that it very, very rarely rains in any way anywhere in Egypt. So this gigantic thunder and lightning hailstorm is obviously a sign from God. And Pharaoh continued hardening his heart. The eighth plague is spoken of in chapter 10. This is the plague of locusts. And locusts, of course, were common in the ancient world. Locusts would come and go, sometimes on a cyclical basis. This is a plague that covers the whole land of Egypt and leaves everybody else out of it. And eventually, the Lord turned the wind into a strong west wind, which drove the locusts into the Red Sea. And Pharaoh decided not to let the people go. The ninth plague is darkness. This is a judgment on the sun god Ra. The Egyptians noted that the dominant light in the sky was the sun. In Egypt, the sun shines every day. The sun begins to shine at dawn, and it continues to shine till sunset. Every day, 365 days a year. It's always a sunny day in Egypt, and it's always hot. And you always have to pay attention to the sunshine because sunburns in Egypt are a way of life. You have to be careful. So it was not unusual that the Egyptians would consider the sun a god. And so Moses says, you're going to have darkness here. Pharaoh called Moses and said, go, serve the Lord, you and your little ones. But Moses said, you also must let us have sacrifices and burnt offerings. Our livestock also must go. Not a hoof shall be left behind. And the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he wouldn't let them go. And so we move on to the final plague. And in chapter 11, Moses threatens this plague. You really need to let the people go because there's going to be another plague, and this is really going to be a bad one. But the Lord will harden Pharaoh's heart. That, of course, takes us up to the last of the plagues. The 10th plague is the death of the firstborn. And this is built up to in chapter 12. God predicts that this is going to happen. He tells Moses and Aaron, 12:1, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. So something is about to happen here in chapter 12, is predicted, and it will take 3 chapters to develop this completely. From 12 through 14, we see this development of what is going to be called the Passover. The 10th plague on Egypt is the death of the firstborn of all of Egypt, in the palace and in the servants' quarters. All of the people would lose the firstborn son. Even the Pharaoh lost his firstborn, as we know from the dream stealing. And more than that, all of the animals will lose their firstborn. So there'll be death all over Egypt. But the people of Israel, as they were protected from the darkness and from the other plagues of God that were sent upon Egypt, the people of Israel will be protected if they perform a certain sacrifice. We're given the details of this. Tell the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. If a household is too small, work together with a neighbor, and you take a lamb without blemish, a year old. And everyone shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they take some of the blood, put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they will eat it. So the sacrifice of a lamb and the sprinkling or painting of blood up and down the doorposts and the lintel of the doorway. Now, there's no magic in this. The issue is one of obedience to instructions. God says basically here, I want you to be obedient to me. I want you to demonstrate your faith by your actions. And maybe this won't make sense, but I want you to do precisely this. Sometimes God's principles don't make perfectly good sense. God never promises that everything he commands us will make perfectly good sense. He simply says, this is what you do next. And we're going to see that this Passover forms an object lesson for Israel of the coming sacrifice of Christ. In the Lord's Supper in the Gospels, Jesus was celebrating the Passover meal. And the elements of the Passover meal are looking forward to the sacrifice of the true Lamb of God, the true, perfect, unblemished Lamb of God. The whole story is meant to set up the gospel message that is yet to come. So then they shall take some of the blood. They must eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any raw or boiled in water, but roasted. And you shall let none of it remain until morning, and then more instructions along the way. Lamb, unleavened bread, bitter herbs. The bitter herbs are a reminder of the bitterness of slavery. The unleavened bread is a reminder of how quickly they had to get out. And traditionally, there are, at the head table in a Passover meal, there are 3 pieces of bread. It's a thin cracker. They're about 20 centimeters square. They're pierced with a thing like a fork, so that they don't bubble up. They're thin like a cracker. And at the beginning of the meal, one of the 3 matzahs in a matzah cover is taken from the cover and broken. And part of that matzah, one of the halves that is broken, is eaten right there. Everybody takes a bit. The other half is hidden, wrapped up in a napkin, and one of the children will go and hide it. And then afterwards, after the meal is all over, and after we've gone out to call for Elijah, then the children will go out and find the afakaman, the other piece of matzah that's been hidden. Afakaman means that which comes after. We would say dessert. Okay. It's significant that the second of 3 is the matzah that is broken. The other 2 are left intact. This is symbolic for us of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. The second person is the one broken for us. This is my body, Jesus says, broken for you. All of this works together. All of this fits together. And we see the foundations of this all the way back here in the book of Exodus. Now, since the time of the destruction of the temple, the Jewish people have not eaten lamb for Passover because there's no place to sacrifice the lamb. Now, they usually eat chicken. And when I've done Passover with churches, we do chicken because it's usually easily available. Maybe we could make an adobo and have it over rice. We can use rice instead of bread. I don't know. It could be fun. Okay. The instructions are given in the rest of chapter 12, and then we see at midnight, this is verse 29, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the captive, the firstborn of the livestock. And Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians. And there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where someone was not dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, Up, go out from among my people, both you and your people of Israel, and go serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds and be gone, and bless me also. So goodbye, good riddance, go away. We would like to see you gone. And this leads us into the larger event that we call the Exodus proper. The actual departure from Egypt takes place on that body of water that you see in the background. That's the Red Sea. And that particular picture is actually taken in the Sinai. The boat that you see there is a ferry boat, and I was driving I was a passenger in a Bedouin bus that had broken down 3 times on the way across the Sinai. And we'd been to Mount Sinai and we'd been to St. Catherine's Monastery, and I was intending to get on that ferry boat and ride up to Aqaba in Jordan. And when we got there, the schedule had said that it would leave that day, that very afternoon. It takes about 2 hours to get up to Aqaba. And when we got there, we discovered that it wasn't going to leave that day at all. They weren't even sure if it would leave that week. So we ended up driving the rest of the way up to Eilat and having to go back through Israel. At any rate, that's the Red Sea. As you can see, this is all a very barren place. This is actually a difficult place to live. The Exodus is going to take us out of a very beautiful area. I don't have a lot of pictures of Egypt, but when you're in Egypt, you're impressed by this narrow band of fertile land next to the Nile itself. Palm trees and lots of fruit and plenty of water. There's no reason that Egypt should not be a very prosperous place. It could actually be very beautiful. It isn't, but there are other reasons for that. The prosperity of Egypt is a gift of the Nile. It ought to be actually quite good, but it's not so much. Okay, so the Egyptians were urgent. They wanted them out. This is verse 32. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading bowls, and the people of Israel had done as Moses had said, and had asked the Egyptians for silver and gold and jewelry and clothing. And the Lord had given the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and let them have what they asked. Thus they plundered Egypt. This is one of the fascinating little passages. This is not a pattern for us today, but it does tell us what God did for Israel at this time. So 1240, gives us the time frame. Here's that verse that I was mentioning earlier. The time that the people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. So God is fairly explicit here with this 430 years. We see the number repeated in some other places, but here is the explicit mention, and it's noted to the very day. When you look at the day that Jacob entered Egypt until the day that Israel comes out of Egypt, 430 years to the day. Now, we don't know if that would be specifically lunar years or whatever. I don't worry too much about that. Recognize that in the dating of these things, there's a certain amount of flex, a certain amount of flop. At the end of 430 years, to the very day, out they went. It was a night of watching by the Lord to bring them out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said to Moses, "This is the statute of the Passover. No foreigner shall eat of it, but every slave that is bought for money may eat of it after you have circumcised him. No foreigner or hired worker may eat it. It shall be eaten in one house. You shall not take any of the flesh," so on. So we've got some rules here for the Passover. In chapter 13, the consecration of the firstborn is given here. Because the firstborn of Egypt were all killed, the firstborn of Israel were not. And God says, remember that the firstborn belong to me. So in some sense, the firstborn sons in all of Israel throughout all of her history had a special spot in God's plan and in God's house. Consecrate the firstborn. This one belongs to me. Now, what that means in practice is actually a little hard to say. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is the period of 7 days prior to or including the Passover meal, during which the Jewish people eat only unleavened bread. This happens in the spring. We're going to see later on in Leviticus. We'll see that Passover is one of the spring festivals, and this includes the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That goes on for a whole week, and Passover usually happens on the Thursday night of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. The whole feast was intended as a reminder that we're leaving in haste. We don't have time to let the bread rise. The end of chapter 13, we have this description of the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire as the people go up out of Egypt. They are led by a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. That's going to continue all the way into the end of the wilderness wanderings, when Joshua takes the people across the Jordan River. The pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire are going to disappear. And instead, they're going to have a new set of leaders. Joshua will lead them in a different way. But all through Moses' leadership, we're going to see this happen. At this point, the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the people of Israel, turn back, camp in front of Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea, in front of Baal-zephon. You shall encamp facing it by the sea. For the Pharaoh will say to the people of the people of Israel, they are wandering in the land. The wilderness has shut them in. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. Now the glory will be mine." So we know that Israel is up against deep water on one side. The term sea here refers to a whole lot of water. The exact location of the crossing of the Red Sea is not given to us. Uh, uh, Modern scholars differ in their understanding of the material. It's actually possible that Israel came up against a thing called the Great Bitter Lakes. There's a series of like 18 lakes that form the line between Egypt and the Sinai. Today are connected by the Suez Canal. It is, I would have pictures of that, but it's against the law to take photographs anywhere close to the Suez Canal. When last time I was there, we actually drove under the Suez Canal. There's a tunnel that goes through there, and of course, it's absolutely forbidden to take pictures. So I don't have any. They were actually fairly insistent about that, and the people insisting were carrying guns. So I did obey. The Suez Canal actually passes along a line that in biblical times was a line of fortresses. The Egyptians made a line of forts along the edge of the desert to keep the Bedouin from coming in. And there were garrisons at each of these forts. Now, a fort is a migdol. The message here, wherever this was taking place, wherever this was happening, God said to Moses, "Make the people camp at Pihahiroth between Migdol, the fortress, and the sea." So there was a fortress there, and you're to camp next to the sea. Now that puts the people between a rock and a hard place because they're very close to an Egyptian garrison. The garrison would not have been anywhere close to big enough to prevent a crossing, or to prevent an escape by the Israelites if they'd wanted to go. But it would have been more than enough to send a messenger back to Pharaoh. So Pharaoh would have known by this time. He would have had scouts out, and he would have known. And the Egyptians pursued, we're told farther down this line, all of Pharaoh's horses and chariots and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them. And they camped at the sea by Pihahiroth in front of Baal-Zephon. Baal-Zephon would have been a mountain. So the mountains of Egypt on the east side of Egypt are toward the south end of the Suez Canal, actually quite some distance south of the Suez Canal. So if we've got a mountain called Baal-Zephon, it has to be at the north end of the Gulf of Suez arm of the Red Sea. That's where I would put it. To understand Baal-Zephon as a place near the Great Bitter Lakes, I think is rather difficult. But as I say, there's a good argument from godly scholars whom I enjoy reading to put the path a little farther north. It doesn't matter all that much. We are told that the people are not to go north toward the Mediterranean. If they had gone north toward the Mediterranean Sea, they would have run into the Egyptian international highway, the King's Highway across the Sinai, and that would be well traveled. The armies were there; they would have run into battle right away. So it didn't go that way. They had to have gone through the Sinai, either in a central route or a southern route. That much is quite clear. So the Egyptians pursued and overtook them. Pharaoh drew near, and the people of Israel lifted up their eyes, And behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and that which they feared was about to come upon them. so, so here we are. And Moses said to the people, "Fear not, stand firm." This is verse 13. Fear not, stand firm, and behold the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. The Egyptians whom you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. Okay, this is a picture of salvation itself. The Lord himself is going to do this thing. And that's when we see the beginning of the actual crossing of the Red Sea. This spot is also the Red Sea. This is probably not the right place either. Doesn't really matter. That's the Red Sea off there in the distance. We're told in verse 21, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and made the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The people went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them to their right hand and on their left. Okay, I want to visualize that. We've got a wall to the right and to the left with dry ground in between. The people are going down into the sea, and they're going to come up on the other side, and the water will be on either side of them like a wall. I can visualize the little kids in the people of Israel. You know, if I was a 7-year-old boy, and I saw the water piled up like a wall on one side, close enough that I could run to it, I would go over there. I know there are dolphins in the Red Sea, and it would be fun to reach up and see if you couldn't touch a dolphin through the water. I mean, admit it. If you were a 7-year-old boy, wouldn't you try? I would, no question about it. This event is ultimately extremely memorable. This is the ultimate Old Testament miracle. In the New Testament, the primary miracle is the resurrection of Christ. In the Old Testament, the redemption miracle is the crossing of the Red Sea. Later on, Joshua is going to be given a lesser crossing, the crossing of the Jordan River, that requires also a miracle. But the crossing of the Red Sea is portrayed as a genuinely enormous miracle. It is a miracle of, well, biblical proportions. This is big. This is really, really big. The key thing to understand about the crossing of the Red Sea is that it forms a burned bridge. Once the people have gone down into the water and come up on the other side, the waters close in over the Egyptian army. So the Egyptians are destroyed. At that point, Israel is on the other side, and there is no going back. They can't cross back over the sea, go back to Egypt, and tell the pharaoh that they're sorry about that. They have destroyed an Egyptian army. We're probably talking about 40 or 50,000 men with all their chariots and horses and all of the equipment. This was a very big deal. And so much of a big deal that for the better part of a century after this time, the Egyptians no longer are able to field a major international adventure with their army. They can no longer do this. Now, because of this, because of what we're seeing here, this crossing of the Red Sea ought to be compared with the Christian practice of baptism. When Israel crosses the Red Sea, they are with Moses there, and they have already exercised faith. The faith is what happened at the time of the Passover. They heard the words of God, they obeyed the words of God, they slaughtered the lamb, they prepared it the way they were told, they splashed the blood as they were instructed, they ate the unleavened bread, they gathered their stuff together, and they headed for the Red Sea. Israel has already exercised faith. The crossing of the Red Sea is the confirmation of salvation. It is the object lesson of the salvation of these believers. Now, there's also a mixed multitude with these people who also crossed the Red Sea, but they were not believers. For the believers in the crowd, the crossing of the Red Sea was the recognition that the old life is gone. I've died. I've been buried with Moses. And now I'm coming up on the other side. I'm no longer identified with Pharaoh. I'm identified with Moses. In the same way, in the New Testament, our baptism, when we are baptized in water, that's a visual object lesson of the spiritual reality of my death to sin, my burial with Christ, and my resurrection with him to a new life. So Israel comes up out of the Red Sea. The people of, or the soldiers of Egypt are dead. Terrible catastrophe for them. Here they come up the other side into the Sinai. And they're going to make a journey from the shores of the Red Sea up into the mountain of God, wherever that might be. And it could be a down south near modern St. Catherine's Monastery, or perhaps not. We'll go back to that after a bit. Chapter 15 is the Song of Moses. This is one of the earliest bits of poetry in the Old Testament. I think the book of Job is earlier poetry, but this Song of Moses is very, very old. It definitely dates to around the time of Moses. There's a song set to these words that we sing here in America. And I'm not going to try to sing. Those of you who've heard me sing know that that's not a good idea. But the Song of Moses is in Hebrew is a folk song in Israel today called Zina Zina. But here's the way it goes. I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. The horse and the rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my song. He's become my salvation. He is my God, and I will praise him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a man of war. The Lord is his name. And it goes on. This whole chapter is that commemorative song. In chapter 15, beginning at verse 22, we see the provision of water. Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea. They went into the wilderness of Shur. They were 3 days and found no water. They came to Marah, and the only water there was bitter. So Moses found a log, threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. This is a miracle. We don't have to worry about what kind of log Moses threw in. By the way, this picture is of an acacia tree. It's not very big, and it was the only tree that I saw on the road from the Red Sea to St. Catherine's Monastery. And so I've labeled this place the scenic route. You can go another way, but there's no tree. So you come this way so that you get to see the tree. It's a very, very dry, arid desert. The southern part of the Sinai has a certain amount of water, not very much, but a certain amount of water. So they took water. Then in chapter 16, we see the introduction of manna. And this one is important. I'll just spend a moment on the manna because it lays the foundation for the rules about the Sabbath day, as we're going to see them later on. And the whole congregation grumbled. This is verse 2, 16:2. The people of Israel said, oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat beside the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill us all with hunger. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, I'm about to rain bread from heaven for you. The people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them whether they will walk in my law or not. So what happens? The manna is little bitty brown globes of something. We don't know exactly what it is. The word manna itself is a Hebrew word that means what is it? So the people didn't know what it was. We to this day don't know what it was, but it was edible. It could be ground into a powder and made into bread. It was good for food. I imagine it would get boring after a while. Maybe you need some spices or a little tomato sauce, or who knows what you put on it to make it taste good. But it's bread, and it would be a flat bread, and the people would have been used to that. But it would come out 6 days a week. And an important part of the regulation here is that the manna will come through 6 days a week, but on the seventh day, the manna will not come. Every day you should gather as much as you need, but no more than what you need. If you take more than you need on any day, it will spoil. So only take what you need, and what you don't eat will spoil by the following morning. So you have to go out every day. When Jesus says in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread, he's reminding us of the fact that God provides for us everything that we need today. There's no promise about the future except that tomorrow God will provide what we need tomorrow. And the day after that, exactly the same. Well, this pattern is going to repeat for 6 days, but on the sixth day, the people are told to gather twice as much. Well, didn't he just say that if you gather too much, it will spoil? Yeah, that's exactly right. But in this case, the extra manna will keep. Then on the seventh day, on Saturday, you're not allowed to do any work. You can't go out and gather manna. If you do go out and gather manna, you won't find any. This is an object lesson. God is the one who provides. And if we are obedient, he will provide everything that we need. Our job is to trust in the completed work of God. So how many days? 6, and then the seventh day we rest. The fourth commandment has to do with the resting on the seventh day, the so-called Sabbath law. The Sabbath was never changed to Sunday. The Sabbath has always been Saturday. When we get to the Ten Commandments, we're going to see that continues to be the same. Okay, that's the bread from heaven. In chapter 17, we see the provision of water. The water comes from the rock. The end of chapter 17, we see the destruction of a Bedouin tribe called the Amalekites. We're going to run into Amalekite tribes all the way through the Old Testament. They are one of the offspring of Ishmael, and they're going to continue to be a problem for Israel throughout all of the Old Testament. Then chapter 18 is a fascinating bit. We're not going to spend time with it, except to say that Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, is a priest of the Midianites. Now, the Midianites are related to the Amalekites. They're all the same stock of what today we'd call the Arabic-speaking people, although they weren't speaking Arabic at this time. And Jethro has some advice for Moses. He says, Moses, don't try to be judging all the problems of all the people all the time. Instead, appoint some helpers who can judge the smaller matters and have the people come to them. So Jethro's advice is to delegate some authority, give other leaders in the group part of the responsibility. And that way they'll learn how to lead. They'll become leaders in their own right. And you won't die early from working too hard. Okay, that's as far as we're going to go. That takes us through chapter 18. We'll begin next time with the 10 Commandments. Let me stop the sharing. Donna and Deborah have gone outside or maybe into town. I'm not sure where they've gone, but they're gone now. And I'm going to unmute all of us so that we can say hi. And I'm going to get us back up to this spot. All right, I see everybody. Everybody's there. They are. Okay, well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jan.
Very much, Dr.
Okay.
Jan.
All right.
Thank you so
Love
much.
you guys.
Have a good day.
Bye. Ciao.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Bon appetit.
Buonasera.
Sarah.
Bye-bye.
Nanotte.
Thank you.
Thank you again.